I've never seen or heard of anything like this before. Somebody said it looked like a moonscape, but the moon looks like a golf course compared to what's up there.
It was almost like looking into hell, because there were, steam plumes everywhere. There were chunks of ice the size of houses laying there melting from where the glaciers had blown up.
Everything was buried in 2 to 3 feet of ash, and we both looked at each other and said, "There's nobody alive here."
It's been 45 years since Mount St. Helens erupted, sending ash from its peak and lava, mud, and debris flowing down the mountainsides. It happened on May 18, 1980. 57 people were killed. It caused an estimated $1 billion in damage, and to this day, it is still the deadliest volcanic eruption in U.S. history. Thanks for joining us for Mount St. Helens 45 years later. I'm Christine Pei. It's one of those "where were you when" moments in Northwest history. King 5's Drew Mickelson starts our coverage with what the eruption taught scientists, including a King 5 employee working at the volcano right before it blew.
The eruption was not a surprise, but despite blast zone predictions, evacuations, and close monitoring, 57 people died the day the landscape up here completely changed.
Spirit Lake was like this idyllic setting, this beautiful blue lake, heavy forest all around it.
In the winter of 1980, developers hoped to build a cross-country ski area at Spirit Lake near the base of Mount St. Helens.
It was a gorgeous place, it really was.
Veteran King 5 meteorologist Rich Marriott worked for the U.S. Forest Service in those days, studying avalanche risks at the potential ski area. But in March, the mountain showed signs of life.
Scientists continue to record constant rumbling. We felt them.
Instead of recreation, Rich and everyone's focus turned to the potential eruption and eventually evacuations.
All day and night, you could feel it. You could feel it.
Rich met the cantankerous Harry Truman, owner of the Mount St. Helens Lodge on Spirit Lake, the man known for refusing to leave the potential blast zone.
It'd be awfully hard. It'd take an act of God, 3 acts of Congress to move me out of there. And Congress moves awful slow,
Now we asked him, what are you going to do if it erupts? And he said, well, I've got a cave over on the other side of the lake, a secret cave, and I've got a speedboat. I'm just going to jump in that and go over there and wait it out till it's done.
10 days later, on the morning of May 18, 1980, the mountain erupted, triggering the largest landslide in recorded history. Truman and dozens of others died. Rich, who had been sent home to Seattle just over a week before the eruption, returned 4 days later as a spotter in a military helicopter looking for survivors.
We saw human tracks in the ash. We saw abandoned cars. We saw a school bus that was kind of into the trees. I mean, it gives me goosebumps thinking about it right now. I mean, it was really, really eerie.
It gives me goosebumps to look at this. It really does.
Rich also flew with an NBC News crew that day.
I mean, this really is something otherworldly. It definitely is. I see something. I don't know if people have ever seen anything like this. This is Spirit Lake. What was it like? Beautiful blue lake, very calm. Freeze over in the winter into a beautiful frozen lake, and now that lake is almost near boiling.
The ceiling was finally lifting a little bit, and we flew up and saw Spirit Lake, just covered in all the trees, and then you could actually see it rose up far enough that you could see that there was a crater there now, and that there wasn't anything above that.
We're looking right into the crater now. Yeah, we're looking right into an area that used to be under thousands of feet of rock.
Mount St. Helens was really a game changer for understanding what we could do about volcanic eruptions.
State seismologist Harold Tobin heads up the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network at the University of Washington.
So here's the mountain itself, and every one of those triangles is a station where we're recording earthquakes. We are really just situated, including 2 right in the crater, actually.
He says the 1980 eruption inspired the state and federal governments to increase seismic monitoring in Washington and Oregon. At the time of the eruption, a dozen seismometers were spread across the Northwest. But since then, that number has climbed to more than 700, and not just around volcanoes.
Here in and around Seattle, we've got a bunch of stations, half a dozen or so.
With the increased coverage, the state can keep tabs on potential hotspots. Last year, quakes suggested Mount St. Helens may be recharging. And while no eruption is imminent, Tobin is confident whenever it blows again, they'll be prepared.
If the slightest sign of unrest came to Mount St. Helens or Mount Rainier, one of the other Cascade volcanoes, we would see it, we would know about it, we would know things like exactly how deep those earthquakes were and whether they were moving upward or moving downward or whatever.
If you think about it, we just get loaned this land while we're here.
Rich Marriott witnessed the power of Mother Nature. He's glad with all that destruction 45 years ago came some lessons.
We just didn't understand what the mountain was trying to tell us that first time. We'll be, the next time Mount St. Helens recharges and tries to do this again, we'll have a much better understanding of what we're dealing with, and people will have a good, solid warning.
Of course, earthquakes come without warnings, but thanks in part to what happened here in 1980 and all the increased monitoring since, the state has established an alert system, providing folks across the Northwest that an earthquake has hit, giving them about 20 seconds to prepare for the next big Northwest natural disaster. At Mount St. Helens, Drew Mickelson, King 5 News.
45 years after the eruption, scientists are still watching as parts of the area rebound. Meteorologist Leah Pizzetti with our Environment Northwest team traveled to one of the hardest hit areas to see what still has room for growth.
Where I'm standing right now was flattened 45 years ago. You can see there's still some tree stumps right here, also some off in the distance beyond me. That's what remains now from the pre-eruption. But you can also see there's a lot of greenery around me. That's one of the things that researchers here at Mount St. Helens are so impressed with, is just how quickly this is coming back to life. The visuals from 1980 tell the story of destruction.
A report of a massive mudslide.
57 lives lost and an entire ecosystem wiped out. When Mount St. Helens erupted, hot ash filled the sky and dumped on surrounding communities. A once dense forest was flattened. Nearly all plant and animal life ended.
The eruption itself was different than we would usually think about, where a volcano erupts up and out. This one erupted out the front of the volcano, and so the landscape right in front of the volcano was dramatically impacted by that eruption.
The eruption turned what was once flat landscape to these hills made up of volcanic debris called hummocks that still stand today. Between them, 150 new ponds formed, mini ecosystems that would eventually support new life. In the days and weeks following the eruption, scientists realized that under the blanket of ash, some creatures shockingly survived, like gophers that had burrowed, then played a key part in bringing life back.
By burrowing, they can mix in old soil into the new ash that's on the top of the land. And what that does is that provides, again, bringing those nutrients in and those conditions that allow plants to actually establish, that creates conditions in which plants can grow.
Donald Brown, lead scientist for Mount St. Helens, says certain plants that could survive in the nitrogen-poor area were some of the first signs of life to spring back. Then animals returned, frogs and toads in the first 3 years.
This is a red-legged frog.
And some species of salamanders 9 years after the eruption. All of this without human intervention.
When the monument was established in 1982, the goal was to not touch it as much as possible and let the natural system come back to the maximum extent possible.
Making these 110,000 acres observation only, letting nature take its course.
One of the stories of this place is that it has recovered dramatically faster than anyone guessed it would have. This was a moonscaped landscape when it started, and nobody would have guessed that it would look like this 45 years later.
But not all life has found its way back. A few salamander species and the coastal tail frog still have not returned, and scientists don't know if or when they will. With a slowdown of new species returning, the focus has now shifted to watching and waiting as the forest returns to its former density, something that will take time.
At this point in time, we're seeing the forest come back in. That's what we're watching. That's not what it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago. even 20 years ago, right? But now that's what we're watching, is the forest reestablished finally.
King 5's coverage with meteorologist Jeff Renner in 2010 shows the beginning of that process.
But King 5 environmental specialist Gary Chittum shows there's been a remarkable resurgence of life.
Moss covered, new grasses, new trees, all forming a new forest.
And now, 15 years after that, there's still a long way to go. Because this disaster is unprecedented, they don't know how long it will take. Brown is studying this timeline, trying to project potential timing.
Best guess today, 60 years. 60 years, I think we're going to see a mature coniferous forest right here.
On this day when we visited, we ran into this group of students.
It started to get a little bit unstable with all those earthquakes happening at the same time.
Some of the 4,000 that attend Mount St. Helens Institute camps every year. A generation who wasn't alive in 1980, and their parents likely weren't either. They're learning from this evolution.
We speak a lot about a large disturbance happening, but then how the landscape and the ecology is really resilient, and that lessons of resilience is a really important takeaway for our school groups.
Carrying all that magma.
The idea is to make sure the next generation understands the destructive force of the volcano and the lifetime it's taking to bring the environment back.
We are truly starting from zero. Barely any nutrients to be found anywhere, starting from nothing, turning into this.
For Environment Northwest, I'm meteorologist Leah Pizzetti.
A National Guard helicopter pilot is sharing never-before-seen photos and memories of the days that followed when he was out on search and rescue missions. St. Brian talks with him about what he experienced.
Yeah, my daughter Kim, she put the book together for me.
By flipping through the pages of a scrapbook, Mike Cairns goes back in time to the day a mountain exploded and the world turned dark and gray.
All the trees were down. They were all facing the same direction. All the bark was gone. All the branches were torn off.
A National Guard pilot who served in Vietnam, Mike volunteered to fly into the blast zone in search of survivors. The thick air, he says, smelled like sulfur. Temperatures above 100 degrees.
Everything was buried in probably 2 to 3 feet of ash. Just saying, this looks like a moonscape. The closer we got to Mount St. Helens, we saw steam vents and ash vents just blowing stuff up all over the place. And we both looked at each other and said, there's nobody alive here.
If they were going to rescue anyone, Mike and his crew knew they'd have to fly out of the blast zone to places where bridges were washed out by lahars.
My crew chief, Mike Semison, said, hey, looks like there's people beating the ground with their jackets to get our attention.
Sue Ruff was one of 2 campers and a logger who had been climbing all day through 15 miles of ash-covered debris.
I said to Sue, we're glad we found you, and she hugged me and kind of cried a little bit. Well, the look on their face showed me that they went through a very traumatic experience.
In all, 138 people were rescued by the National Guard, but most of Mike's mission would be a heartbreaking story of recovering the dead.
These guys were, husband and wife were mummified. It was just horrible.
4 days after the eruption, heavy rains revealed gruesome sights.
Aside from Vietnam, I've never seen anything like this. The bodies were melted, they were destroyed. We found body parts.
The pilots gathered at the end of every day to talk about what they'd seen.
We'd fly 12 hours a day just refueling and searching and looking and trying to find.
Get it, McCartney, get it, go get it. 45 years later, Mike Cairns wanted his story told and realized he'd better do it himself. Under the Ash is a book about his troops' heroic response to a mountain's historic fury. Dangerous days Mike will never forget.
And it's been said that it was the National Guard's finest hour.
A 30-year-old volcanologist with the U.S. Geological Survey was swept away and killed when the mountain erupted. He was on Mount St. Helens working to monitor what was happening with the volcano. 5 years ago, King 5's Glenn Farley looked at his legacy and how he likely saved hundreds of more lives.
The pictures can only suggest the power of that eruption captured on a clear, sunny Sunday morning of May 18, 1980. The top 1,400 feet of the mountain blown off. That explosion prompting perhaps the most famous last words said in the Pacific Northwest. Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. This is the man who said those words, trying to provide the warning to the rest of us 40 years ago. David Johnston, scientist.
David and I were standing on a mountain ridge doing an interview, and David said, we're essentially sitting next to a keg of dynamite. He said, the fuse is lit, but we don't know how long that fuse is.
Jeff Renner was King 5's meteorologist, but in 1980 he was the station's science reporter, reporting live from St. Helens, even from the inside of a camper.
It's because the weather here is so very stormy.
Located in what would become known as the blast zone on the north side of Mount St. Helens. He had met Johnston 2 years earlier.
If we were to stand here when that went off, we would surely die. Well, he was right.
Well, obviously we didn't know ultimately what would happen. We knew it was a very hazardous place. In fact, we had a station at Spirit Lake that had to be serviced every 5 days, and we knew that was too dangerous.
Steve Malone is now a professor emeritus at the University of Washington. At one point, Johnston was his student.
This is a gravity meter.
This is Malone 40 years ago, his hair darker. He's a seismologist studying earthquakes. Johnston specialized in volcanoes. Earthquakes are precursors to eruptions, and the two remain connected during the emergency. For months, thousands of small quakes had shaken the ground under Mount St. Helens, indicating molten rock was on the move.
There's all these earthquakes going on.
As the ground trembled, as the north side of the mountain bulged out, as property owners hung out at roadblocks, allowed to check on their cabins and homes just a day before the eruption. What nobody knew was the trigger point, and everybody was tired of waiting. Renner, photographer Mark Anderson, and engineer Mike Carter came home on Thursday for good reason. It was Carter's wedding anniversary. Had you stayed, what would have happened?
I wouldn't be talking to you today. We were camped, I believe the name of the small ridge or knob, as it were, was Spud Mountain. And it was directly within the blast zone to the north of the volcano. We first started out camping in a camper trailer, and then we moved into a tent so that we could get even closer.
On Friday, Malone flew over a camper where David Johnston was staying to monitor the mountain for signs of trouble.
I was installing 2 stations on May 16th, one at Elk Rock to the west, and another one at a site called SOS just near Timberline. And flying in the helicopter across there, I could look over and see the camper that was up on Coldwater Ridge.
There may also be some changes in the roadblocks in this area, at least if local merchants have their say.
Another trip for cabin owners was planned for Sunday morning. Renner says had the eruption come an hour later, instead of 57 dead, it could have been hundreds. The eruption began at 8:32 in the morning. Did you think of David that morning?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Very early on, when I heard how big it was, that was one of the first thoughts, not knowing. And then probably late in the morning when the word was coming in that the devastation area was huge, it started to sink in.
David Johnston was literally blasted off the mountain ridge that he was on, and his body was never found.
Renner and the King team flew back to their old camping site to find this Datsun B210, the driver still at the wheel.
And I asked our helicopter pilot, Bob Wright, to set us down. I just needed, for a sense of closure, to see what had happened to this person. And all I'll say is that if you had experienced the heat of that blast, it was not a pleasant sight, but it firmly implanted in my mind to this day how close I came, how close Mark came, how close Mike Carter came. And the fact that we didn't told me that I had to make good advantage. I had to take good advantage of the time that was given to me. Because that was, I view that as a gift. Not everybody got that day.
You could feel the palpable despondency, the sadness, the we weren't able to do what we hoped we could do by anticipating hours or a day ahead something big.
Johnston was heard over the radio that Sunday morning, alerting his colleagues in the final seconds of his life. Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. Mount St. Helens is still considered the second most dangerous volcano in the United States. And over there is an observatory named for David Johnston. At Mount St. Helens, Glenn Farley, King 5 News.
A ranger's first day on the job at Mount St. Helens was the day the mountain blew. Up next, his goal to document the volcano's history all these years later. A ranger who started working at Mount St. Helens the day of the eruption is now documenting the volcano's transformation. Jim Dever spoke to him 5 years ago about his experience at the mountain before and after it erupted.
When Francisco Valenzuela reported to his first day as a ranger at Mount St. Helens, he set out with mountaineer Robert Rogers to explore his new territory. It was the morning of May 18th, 1980.
I took a little break in the dawn light by laying on a log, and I could feel the log actually shake underneath me. And I told Robert, you know, this is probably not a good place to be. And so we hightailed it out back to our cars. And shortly after we got back there, the mountain erupted with, no warning. It was a major earthquake that rippled across the landscape. It looked like somebody dropped a stone in a pond, and you could see the waves of land moving like jello. And then the entire mountain exploded.
Valenzuela had one thought as he sheltered in his car.
Well, what I was really worried about was, I can't be about to die on my first day of work. This is not good.
A shift in the wind spared them and gave them a front seat view.
I think Robert Rogers and I were the closest people on the ground to survive the eruption. So we were very close.
After the eruption, Valenzuela documented the destruction and rebirth. Clearwater Valley, drowned in ash in 1981.
Every last tree and every last plant basically was killed in that valley.
Logged off, then returning to life. And a Ghost Lake outlet, Regeneration. He uses a Graflex Super Speed, a vintage press camera, to tell this once-in-a-lifetime story.
The reason I got that camera is because the film is large. It's about this big, and it's very, very detailed. These photographs were always taken with the intent to be a human viewpoint of what's going on.
In 2019, he received an American Recreation Coalition Legends Award for connecting people with the outdoors. And even though this ranger's retired, he'll always be connected to this place.
I feel blessed by it. Even though, in the beginning, it was about to kill me, but in the end, it gave me more life and energy and pushed my career forward. It's going to be a long story. And someday, most likely, it will erupt again.
A high school student from Seattle captures iconic photos after the mountain blew. Coming up, what she saw in the hours after the eruption. In 1980, a Seattle high school student was on a field trip in Vantage when Mount St. Helens erupted. The team took incredible photos of ash billowing in the air. Michael Crow spoke with her 5 years ago about what she remembers from that day.
When Mount St. Helens erupted, the scale of the devastation was incredible.
Oh my gosh, I can't even believe it was 40 years ago.
But on that day in 1980, 200 miles away near the town of Vantage,
this was spring of my freshman year in high school at Garfield High School.
Carmen Andrews was on a field trip.
We were packing up to get ready to go, and we didn't realize it at the time, but later realized that we actually heard Mount St. Helens erupt.
They began the drive back to Seattle as the sky got darker and darker. They stopped at a lookout where she snapped these pictures, images she'll never forget.
First thought we were like in some sort of a sandstorm, and then kind of felt the hair on our heads standing up, and there was pink lightning that was going kind of horizontally through the clouds, which was a bit creepy. And that's when we decided, oh, we better take a picture and get out of here. And until we get back in the van from after that picture, that's when we heard on the radio that Mount St. Helens had erupted.
They ended up stranded in Vantage for 3 days. Now, 40 years later, she looks back on the experience in awe, one of many people that bore witness to one of the biggest disasters and historical moments in the Northwest.
And I can even kind of put myself back there, and that picture when we're on the bluff looking over the Columbia River Gorge, it was so quiet. It was just eerie. We said it felt like we were back in Land of the Lost.
Michael Crow, King 5 News.
The eruption changed the Pacific Northwest forever. 45 years later, we are reminded not only of the devastation that unfolded, but also the extraordinary resilience that followed. To see all of our stories, including our original coverage from 1980, text the word ERUPT to 206-448-4545, and we'll send you a link. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.